Today we're going to take a look at the weapon components that we have created so far and their associated data components and see what changes we can make to make it easier to create new weapon components in the future. So try and identify things in the code that we are doing repeatedly that we could just do once in, say, a parent class or using generics. So welcome to Barton. My name is Heinrich, and let's get into it. Let's start by just opening up our IDE, and we're going to take a look at some of our scripts. So if we take a look at our weapons folder, we have quite a few scripts going on here. The ones that are currently most important to us is our weapon components, our component data scripts, and then our attack data scripts. So let's start by opening up our WeaponSprite script. We scroll up to our variables. We have this private WeaponSprite data called data. Now, if we take a look at our movement weapon component, we have the same thing, private movement data, data. So two different types, but ultimately each component has a data class that it is referencing. So what this means is every time we create a new weapon component, we have to declare a variable for the data, and then somewhere, for example in the awake function, we have to go and get that data from the weapon itself. So this is a prime candidate for something that can be abstracted and moved somewhere else to avoid having to write this repetitive code. So what can we do about this? Well, if we know that every single weapon component is going to have an associated data component, which it will because we build up our weapon logic based on these data components, that means we can come and take a look at our weapon component script, and maybe there's a change we can make here to make it so that the data is generic enough, and we can define all this logic here once, and then our child classes that inherit from weapon component just has access to their data without us having to re-specify it. So because every weapon component has a different weapon component data type, that means this is a great place to make use of generics. Now, as always, I'm not going to do a deep dive into what generics are. There are plenty of really good videos out there on YouTube, and I'll link some in the description. But essentially what it boils down to is we can specify a place for a type, and then whenever we make use of that class or function, we tell it what that type is. So let's see what we can do about that. So in our WeaponComponent.cs file, underneath our abstract class that we have already created, let's go ahead and create another class. This is also going to be public abstract, and it is a class that we'll call WeaponComponent, just like what we have above. But now we're going to put an angle bracket and the letter T, like that, specifying that this is a generic class, and we want this to inherit from our other weapon component class that we created up here. So it's inheriting from this weapon component class. So now down where we declared this new class, we can specify what our generic type T is limited to. So we have this component data base class, so we know that every weapon component's data is going to inherit from component data. So over here, we can say where T colon, and let me just close this. So where T is a component data. Now you can see here, it is missing a reference. So it wants us to say ComponentData.ComponentData because our class is called ComponentData and it is in the namespace ComponentData. So I'm actually going to rename this, and I just want this to be pardoned.weapons.components without the component data. It's going to have some conflicts, but that's fine. If we take a look at our movement data and our weapon sprite data, everything there is fine. And then if we come back down to our weapon component, we can just go ahead and get rid of that. So it's just component data. Okay, so how is this helping us? And why do we create a separate class instead of simply making this one that we've already created a generic? And the reason we have not made it a generic is because of our list. So in our weapon data scriptable object over here, we have this list that uses the type component data. Now, unfortunately, we can't use a generic class here without specifying what the generic type is. So this is why we had to create another class that is generic that inherits from this one. So let's go back to our weapon component class, and let's take a look at what we're going to do next. So in this new generic class that we created, we've said, okay, we have this generic type T that is the component data for this weapon component. So what do we need? We need a protected variable of type T called data. So this is the data for this component. We can then go ahead and take care of getting this data in our awake function. So we can say override awake. That's going to auto-generate the protected override void awake function for us. And in here, all we need to say is data equals weapon, which we have access to because we are inheriting from weapon component. And we say dot data dot get data. And if you remember, our get data function is a generic function that takes in the type that we're looking for. And in here, we can just pass on the type T, like that. So now what we've done is we've taken care of this code over here. You can see in the awake function, we're saying data equals weapon data dot get data, passing in the movement data. So we don't need this anymore. We can get rid of the awake, okay? In our movement script or in our movement weapon component. We can get rid of the data variable, and we can just leave this data over here. But as you see, we have an error now, and that is because our movement class is inheriting from weapon component instead of the generic type. So what we need to do is come up to weapon component here and specify what the generic type is. In this case, it is movement data, like that. And as you can see, our error went away because now the class that we're inheriting from has this data variable and all the types and things match up because of our generic. How cool is that? So now our movement weapon component is making use of this new generic class that we can inherit from, and our sprites component is not yet. So let's just go ahead and actually test the game and see if both movements and sprites still work. So we're actually getting a bunch of errors, and this is again coming down to our scriptable object assets. So it's telling us that we're missing a type referenced from the component weapon data scriptable object on the game object sword1 and sword2. And you can see here, if we click on either of these and we look at our component data list, that the elements are no longer able to be opened so we can view what that component type is and edit the data. And that is because we edited the namespace. So if you didn't edit the namespace, you should still be fine. But in our case here, if we go ahead and take a look at our sword1 asset, you can see over here that the type movement data comes from the namespace bardent.weapons.components.componentData. But because we renamed or refactored our namespace to just be bardent.weapons.components, we just need to get rid of this part. So it's kind of annoying that it's not doing this for us, but it's okay. At least we have a little bit of knowledge to dig around in this YAML file and fix the things as we need. So we did that for the movement data. We also need to come and do that for the sprite data over here. So just get rid of that. And now if we go back to Unity, we've only fixed the one so far, sword1, but you can see here is all of our sprite data again, and here's all of our movement data. So let's come back to our script and let's do the same thing for sword_2.asset. So from our movement data class, get rid of this. And then from our sprites class, get rid of that. Okay, hopefully we won't have to edit the asset too much more in the future. But unfortunately, whenever we do refactor things, we might run into some issues like this. But if we go back to Unity now, everything should be good. We have all of our data again. Perfect. Okay, we can go ahead and just clear this. Everything should be fine. So now if we run the game and we go ahead and attack, you can see we can still see our weapon sprite, even though it is not making use of the generic component, which is fine. But the important part is we're moving without having to declare that variable. We simply specified in the generic type that this is movement data. Beautiful. Perfect. Okay, this is great. Let's go back to our script and let's make the same change for our weapon sprite component. So let's come up, open up our weapon sprite class. And over here, again, we have this private weapon sprite data. We can just get rid of that and then make our generic type weapon sprite data, like that. So again, now we're not getting any errors with our data variable over here because we're inheriting that. And let's just test again, just for the fun of it. If we go ahead and run the game, our sprites still work. Okay, so what else can we do? Let's go ahead and quickly take a look at our code again and see if there's anything else there that we might be able to just abstract away to the parent class. So back in our IDE, I'm just going to cut to the chase and tell you exactly what it is. Let's take a look at our movement component again. Over here in our handleStartMovement function, we get a reference to our CurrentAttackData. And in our WeaponSprite component, we're actually doing the same thing. So if we take a look over here, we're kind of skipping an extra step and getting the sprites from that data, but we are accessing the CurrentAttackData. So maybe let's go ahead and also take care of that in our base WeaponComponent class, so that every weapon component automatically, without us having to write any extra code, has access to its data, and automatically whenever another attack happens, updates the CurrentAttackData to whatever it needs to be. So how can we do this? It's going to get a little bit interesting. Let's go ahead and come back to our WeaponComponent class. And in here, in our generic WeaponComponent class, we need to go ahead and declare another variable for our CurrentAttackData. So we can say protected, but what's our type going to be? Every weapon component has a different type for each attack's data. So what can we do now? Well, luckily we can specify more than one generic type for a class. So over here from T, let's go ahead and F2 on that and just rename it to T1. And then we can say comma T2. And you can name this whatever you want. This is just kind of the standard that you can follow. So we now have generic type T1 and generic type T2. And what we've done is we've limited generic type T1 to being a component data, but we still need to limit T2 to be something. But we'll do that in just a second because we can't do that just yet. But so now we can say protected T2 and call this CurrentAttackData. And then what we can do is whenever an attack starts, so when we enter a weapon, we can go ahead and set this data. And luckily for us, we already created this handleEnter and handleExit functions in our base weapon component class that we are inheriting from. So we can just go ahead and override that. So we say override handleEnter, and then after base.handleEnter, we can say CurrentAttackData equals data.attackData, which actually isn't bringing anything up because I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Sorry, let's take a step back. Let's comment this out. So we have this CurrentAttackData variable that we would like to set. We have this generic type T2, but we don't know anything about it. This could literally be any type that we specify. So we need to limit this somehow. Now for T1, what we did is we limited this to be a component data, which is the base class for any weapon component. Now our attack data, which is in this attack data folder, currently are just normal classes. They don't inherit from anything. So we need to create a base class for attack data, which these classes will then inherit from. So that way we can get the CurrentAttackData no problem. So in our attack data folder, let's go ahead and add a new C# class. And let's just call it AttackData, like this. And then we can come to our AttackMovement class, make this inherit from AttackData, and then do the same thing for our AttackSprites. So inherit from AttackData, like that. And then with that done, we can come back to our WeaponComponent class and limit the type of our T2 generic type. So after this, we can then just say where T2 is a attack data. And again, we have some issues with the namespaces. This is quite frustrating. Let's go back to our attack data, rename on the namespace. I'm going to remove attack data. I just want it to be barden.weapons.components. Don't care about the conflicts. It's fine. We'll fix those. Next, come back to our weapon component and get rid of components. We just want attack data. Okay, so we have now specified that our T1 needs to be a component data and our T2 needs to be an attack data. Cool, so now with that, maybe we're able to set our current attack data to something, but actually not quite yet. So we know that our T1 is our component data. I've said that many times, but bear with me. So we have our component data, which typically has an array of another data type, where that data type represents one attack's data. So we need to look at this array, look at the current attack counter, and get that information. But if we take a look at our component data real quick, so come over here to component data, this is just an empty class. And as far as our generic weapon component class is aware, this is all it has to work with. So there's no information in component data yet for us to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to make our component data class also generic. And then in that generic type, we specify what the type is for our specific attack data. I hope that makes sense. So that way, again, just like we've done with our component data, where we have this variable to specify the component data, we're going to have the same thing on the component data, where we have a generic variable that specifies the attack data. That way we know component data has attack data, and we can access that over here to set the current attack data. I hope that makes sense. But let's work through it slowly, and hopefully everything will make sense. Again, always just feel free to ask me questions in Discord. I'm always happy to help. So we again need to go ahead and create a separate class that is our generic version of the component data. And here we're going to say where t is attack data, like that. But we also actually want to inherit from component data. And the reason we need to make two classes like this is exactly the same as before. So because over here in our weapon component, we are specifying that T1 can only be a component data, this cannot be a generic type. Otherwise, we would have had to specify what that generic type is over here as well, which we cannot do. So we need a base class that is not generic, and then we inherit from that and create the generic class. Okay, so let's come back to component data. And then over here for our new generic class, let's just go ahead and add the serializable attribute before we forget. And then in here, what we're going to do is we're going to say field, serialize field, public, t array, and we'll just call it attack data. And then don't forget to give it a public getter and a private setter. So what that means is we can come back to our weapon component class. And now over here, what we actually want to do is come to where we say that T1 needs to be a component data. And over here, we'll pass in T2 as the data type. So actually, now that I think about it, maybe we didn't have to make a separate class. Whoops. But it's also fine because I'm sure somewhere else. Actually, no, wait. No, I'm sure there's some reason why they had to be separate. But yes, so in this case, maybe not, but it is okay the way that it is. Let's move on. So now that we've specified that component data has a generic type of T2, which we've passed in over here, that means we can come back to our handle enter function. So we can say CurrentAttackData equals data.attackData square bracket weapon.currentAttackCounter. Okay, so now whenever the enter function on the weapon is called, we're going to set our current attack data appropriately. So now what we need to do is come back to our WeaponSprite and movement weapon components. Let's start with movement. And this is again broken because we're only specifying one type over here. We need to also specify what our attack data is. So after movement data, our current attack data is simply called attack movement, like that, and it's giving us an error. Why is it giving us an error? And it's giving us an error for movement data because our movement data is not using that new generic type that we created yet. So let's come over to movement data over here, and you can see that we're inheriting from component data. So over here, we actually need to inherit from component data, and we specify attack movement as our generic type. And that actually means we can get rid of this variable, but I'm not going to do it just yet, and I'll show you why in just a second. So just hold on to this. Go ahead and come to our WeaponSprite data script. and do the same thing here. So the generic type is our attack sprites, like that. Now, if we come back to our movement weapon component, you can see that it no longer has an issue with movement data. Next, we can come to our WeaponSprite class. And now over here for our generic type, it's WeaponSprite And then after that, our AttackData type is simply attack sprites. And that now means that we can come and get rid of the code where we get the current attack data. So for our weapon sprites, it's going to be a little bit of an extra change because we're accessing .sprites over here. But we can actually say is var current attack sprites, instead of all of this, is simply current attack data dot sprites. And then in our movement weapon component, over here where we get the current attack data, we can simply get rid of that completely and it'll still work because we have this current attack data over here. So I hope that made sense. Let's go ahead and quickly try and test it and just make sure that everything is still working. Okay, so we're getting a couple of errors, and I do believe it has to do with the fact that we didn't delete those variables when we used the generic type. But the reason I didn't delete them is because when I was practicing for this episode and I deleted them, the arrays lost all their information. So now it's like serialized everything properly, but it's getting confused because there's multiple things with the same name. Our base class has an array that is called AttackData, and then the child class inheriting from it also has a variable called AttackData. So now that we've come back to Unity and we've let it recompile and reserialize and deserialize everything, we can come back to our editor, and then we can come to our movement data class and simply get rid of all of this. So now it's an empty class, but it won't always be empty. We're going to add some stuff in here later, but the important information for now, the attack data that we want, is being taken care of with this. And then we can do the same thing with our weapon sprite data. So click over here, get rid of this line, and just another empty class. But now if we come back to Unity, hopefully we shouldn't have any errors. I think if we look at this, everything's still fine. We have our weapon sprites, and we have our movement data, but this is now coming from that generic type instead. So now if we run the game, and we attack, we're still moving, and we still have our sprites. How cool is that? So now, whenever we create a new component data, we just create a new class, and then simply just specify the generic type over here. It'll take care of creating the array for us because we've already done that once over here in a generic way. And then our weapon component itself, when it uses this data, will have access to all the information that it already needs. So we've just cut down on quite a bit of code that we have to write later on for other components that we're going to be creating. Now, if you're confused as to why we're doing this is just something that I did way further on in the development of the prototype for this project because I was getting tired of rewriting all of these things that I just mentioned. So don't expect yourself to know to do this after creating just 2 components. It did take me quite a while to figure that out. I'm just doing it now, that way we don't have a lot of refactoring to do later on. So I hope that made sense. It's a little bit all over the place, but just take a look at the code on the GitHub, take some time to digest it, and if you have any questions, just drop me a message on Discord. I'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you might have as to why I've done a certain thing a certain way over here. And so that's going to do it for this episode. If you would like early access to the prototype that I'm using for this project, it is available to all of my Patreon tiers over on Patreon. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at how we can use reflection to automatically generate the buttons that we need to add our components to that list on the scriptable object. So that way, whenever we create more components, which we're going to be creating quite a few of them, we don't have to keep adding functions like this to our scriptable object to add these new components. It'll just do it automatically. It'll find all of these data classes and create a list of buttons for us. So that's the plan for next episode. And so before I go, I would just like to say thank you to all of my supporters and wonderful people over on Patreon, and a huge special thank you to Cody Lee, SM, Major Sins, Jake Skarupa, Tommy, Mike Rodriguez, and Nathan Ackley for your support on Patreon. You guys are absolute mad lads, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.